Hello, this is Professor Joseph Holbrook in continuation of our series on Latin American civilization. Today we're going to take a look at Chapter 11 of Martin and Wasserman's book, and we're going to focus on the theme of economic modernization of Latin America 1880 through 1920. So during this period of time there were momentous changes in the world economy. For one thing, technology, transportation technology, communication technology changed rapidly. Railroads, steamships, telegraphs, and telephones made it possible for people, goods, ideas, and money to move rapidly across the globe, across oceans and international boundaries. In Western Europe and the United States, most people lived in cities and earned their livelihoods in industry rather than agriculture. The timeline begins with 1878 with Porfirio Diaz taking power in Mexico, a caudillo, and he starts out as a liberal and a friend of Benito Juarez, but he ends up being a dictatorial autocrat. In 1888, slavery is abolished in Brazil. We've already talked a little bit about Brazil, and the empire was overthrown a few months later and was replaced by an oligarchic republic. 1891, there was a civil war in Chile. And 1895, you have the Second Cuban War of Independence, which begins. The first was in 1868. And then one of the more dramatic events of history, in 1910, the Mexican Revolution explodes, bringing an end to El Porfiriato, the rule of Porfirio Diaz. In 1912, Argentina extended male suffrage. In 1916, Hipólito Yrigoyen was elected in Argentina on a populist platform. And in 1917, the Mexican Revolution begins its final phase with the elaboration of the Mexican Constitution, a reformist document putting forth labor reforms as well as land reforms. And in 1918, Argentina is the Semana Trágica. So during this time, there was an export boom in Latin America. This was the export of raw materials, of agricultural products. It created two new crucial social classes, an urban middle class and an urban industrial working class. Demands for equality and equity eventually brought an end to the rule of the large landowners during this period of time. The export economy expanded in size and the role of government. Some of the characteristics of this export boom included that most nations concentrated on one or two export commodities. There were some nations that as much as 60 or 70% of their gross national product came from one export commodity. For example, in Brazil, it was coffee and sugar. Colombia, coffee. Cuba, sugar and tobacco, and to some extent coffee. Honduras, bananas. The second was that the booms were not sustainable for more than a decade or two. Every boom is eventually followed with a bust. This is called the boom-bust cycle of global capitalism. Third, the question of who actually benefited from the expansion of the exports. Finally, poor linkages between the export economy and domestic sectors of the economy. So a lot of income via export did not always translate into national development. There were also during this period of time new farming techniques, which included which was facilitated by railroads and communications and steamships. The new ships reduced the route from Buenos Aires to Europe from several months to a few weeks. It also made it possible with refrigerated shipping to send Buenos Aires, or Argentina's #1 product was beef and hides, and now it was possible to send fresh meat and other delicate commodities from Argentina to Europe, which created quite an economic boom in Argentina. Latin America possessed the natural resources to help satisfy the North Atlantic market. The North Atlantic meaning Western Europe, and the United States and Canada. Great Britain accounted for the largest share of foreign investment in Latin America in this period, but from 1900 to 1914, U.S. investment in Latin America quintupled. Mexico received the most capital, more than $1 billion. This was before the Mexican Revolution. Argentine exports grew sevenfold. By 1893, they doubled again. Brazilian coffee exports more than doubled in the years between 1844 and 1874, and it quadrupled again from 74 to 1905. Colombian, Costa Rican, and Venezuelan coffee exports also increased spectacularly. The total Mexican exports rose nearly 700%. Bolivia exported 10, which jumped by 1,200% during this period. Despite the growth, export-led modernization proved a mixed blessing, and it certainly had its downside. Few Latin American nations were able to sustain such steady high growth. Latin America's vulnerability to world market fluctuations, boom and bust cycles, created instability. Major depressions in the world economy happened in the 1890s and again in 1907. This is why 1929 is called the Great Depression, because it was not the only one. It was just simply more severe. In terms of transportation technology, the railroads was the greatest agent of change in the 19th century, according to our textbook. It was inexpensive transportation for agricultural commodities, minerals, and people. It brought together nations torn by regionalism, and it was a symbol of unwanted modernization to some. Modernization and social change. One of the major changes during this period was population increase. Growth that many areas had experienced in the late colonial period came to a halt. Warfare and mortality of the War of Independence contributed to this, but it began to grow again by the 1880s, the population. Argentina, for example, doubled from 1895 to 1914. Buenos Aires went from a city population of 178,000 to nearly 1.6 million in 1914. There were mass movements of people from Europe. 45 million left Europe to go to the Americas, mainly Argentina, Brazil, and Cuba. Brazil's population, for example, went from 10 million at the beginning of this period to over 31 million, to almost 31 million in 1920. That's a threefold increase. The cities of Brazil exploded, principally Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. Complex new middle sector and industrial working classes arose during this population boom. White-collar employees multiplied. Not earning income sufficient for full-fledged middle-class status, they lived precariously. The rapidly emerging industrial working class was quite diverse. Expanding literacy rates among the middle classes was another feature. In Brazil, it went from 19% of men in the who were literate and able to read and write in 1896 to over 60% in 1920 who were literate. Here's a artist's rendition of a mining camp in Chile. Very arduous labor conditions in these mining camps. This shows the destination of European immigrants to Latin America from this time period, 1820 to about 1932. The largest number is Argentina, many from Italy as well as Spain. Brazil received over 4 million immigrants from Europe. Cuba, surprisingly, comes out in third place with over 1 million, almost 1,400,000. Then you're followed by Uruguay, Mexico, Chile, Venezuela, Peru, and Paraguay. No surprise that Paraguay would be one of the least. The growth of Latin American economies from the late 19th to the early 20th centuries demonstrated an impressive degree of political stability, which in turn fostered economic growth. It was a safe climate for foreign investment. Now, this is before the Mexican Revolution in Mexico that we're talking about. Prosperity allowed the ruling classes to pay for better equipped professional armies. Railroads were able to move troops quickly, and there was a ruling ideology called the philosophy of Positivism. Positivism and social Darwinianism came from two thinkers. Positivism can be attributed to a Frenchman, Auguste Comte, who lived from around the turn of the century to the mid-19th century. He emphasized science and reason, order and progress. Positivism was very empirical and was focused on orderly progress using science, technology, and reason. Several dictatorships adopted positivist ideologies. One was Porfirio Diaz in Mexico. Antonio Guzman Blanco was another one in Venezuela. Herbert Spencer was another philosophical thinker who applied the idea of survival of the fittest to racial and ethnic groups. And not necessarily he himself, but his thinking was used to justify scientific racism. The idea that certain races were superior to others and better adapted for survival. So, on the left you have Auguste Comte, and on the right you have Herbert Spencer. You notice the Brazilian flag. I think I've mentioned before that it had no red color in the flag, which some people pointed out that red in the flag is a symbol of blood that's been spilled for the patria, and no blood was spilled for the independence of Brazil. But you see that the saying that's on there is Orden y Progreso, order and progress, which was the most popular saying of positivism. This was the flag that was adopted in the early republic. Politics in the age of modernization. So during this time, these countries were able to afford modernized militaries. The upper classes sought to modernize and professionalize the armed services. The military was an ally of the upper classes. Latin American militaries were participants in the struggle over the social question. They had revamped militaries, separation, and confidence. In Argentina, it was General Julio A. Roca who consolidated the nation. He dominated Argentine politics at the end of the century, first through puppets and then as president himself at the turn of the century, using a combination of patronage and force, which we've come to be familiar with the rule of caudillos. The middle class tended to adhere to the Radical Party, known as the Unión Cívica Radical. The Radical Party challenged the rule of the landowners, the old oligarchic and aristocratic landowners. The Buenos Aires working class was divided between anarchists and socialists. This is a picture of General Julio Roca of Argentina. Kind of intense. In Brazil, the emergent working classes were weaker and the upper classes were stronger than in Argentina. Also, democracy was emerging in Chile. The landed upper class ruled until 1920, and then Chilean politics entered into a crisis as the need was to include new emerging social groups. In Peru can be described as the aristocratic republic. It went through the War of the Pacific. It had social unrest in 1913 with strikes in Lima and Callao. In Mexico, we had the Porfiriato, the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, which I'm going to talk about next in the next episode. He had to flee the country in 1910 after 30 years of authoritarian rule. The indigenous peoples were widely regarded by governments and upper classes as a serious impediment to national progress. The notion that the modernization and economic development were good was not accepted by everyone. There was a political attempt to create social equality. The Mexican Revolution exploded during this time with a diverse coalition of profoundly discontented people. And it was finally won by Álvaro Obregón. And that is chapter 11.